Hi, my name is William Matthew Lynn, and I'm here to present a podcast about the foundation of the 75th Rangers Regiment. The United States Army Rangers are some of the most elite soldiers in the world at the current time. They handle primarily special forces for the United States Army, and they are known as more or less special operators, and they have unique missions. Um, highly specialized. They're very highly trained soldiers, um, and they really are they really do set the standard in a lot of ways for the modern day combatant. Now, there have always been a historical precedent for special operations soldiers or elite units within the wider military structure. Some early examples. I mean, perhaps it's not the best example in the world, but the Persian Immortals, I think, is one unit that began to kind of distinguish itself early in the ancient world. They were 10,000 heavy infantrymen who doubled as the Imperial Guard and as a standing army. They never dropped in number, and this was where the title of Immortals came from. Is that no matter what, there was always 10,000, and so this was a very fear-inducing kind of they have this aura about them in that sense. But I think a more appropriate uh, you know example to study from the Greco-Roman world, from the Hellenistic world, that is the Sacred Band of Thebes. Now, the Sacred Band of Thebes is a very interesting unit because it was made up of 150 homosexual couples. Now, this unit was formed in 378 before Christ by General Georgidas. General Georgidas was a Theban general who thought that if two people, the partners on the battlefield, were in love with each other, then they would work harder for one another. They would fight harder for one another, and they would give their lives to save the life of their fellow man. They would not retreat. They would not abandon their lovers on the field per se. Um, and so he implemented this by he had these 150 couples, so 300 warriors total. When one would fall in battle, the next most elite fighter in the city was invited to join the Sacred Band of Thebes, um, and he was generally younger, actually always younger, and he was paired with an older veteran, and he was paired with him, and that emotional sexual bond that they would develop between them was thought to make them stronger in battle. And this actually worked very well. Or the band at least was very successful. The Sacred Band of Thebes was very successful in combat. They were eventually annihilated by King Philip of Macedon, but they had a good run before that. They had a lot of successes against historically famed units like the Spartans. Had a lot of successes against the Spartans, and so this kind of demonstrated the importance and the need for special units, and the aura they bring, and the swagger they can bring to a military unit. Now, special units and their use and their importance varied throughout history. For a long time in the European, Asian theater, you didn't have a lot of special units. Some people consider, knights special units or whatnot. I can see that argument, but they were quasi royalty, so on and so forth. But when you talk about, a special operations unit, as we talk about the Army Rangers, as we talk about the Special Air Service, as we talk about Spetsnaz, would we see the emergence of that in the Age of Discovery and in the Americas? Now, prior to that, the European method of combat, um, and the technology available at the time discouraged such units. It was very much, rifles and whatnot weren't really accurate, except the very, most expensive ones, especially the early rifles, the arbicusers as they were called. No one's doing anything sneaky with that. Nobody's, sneaking up on you with an arbacuser. It's, a very bulky weapon. It takes a long time to load. It's inaccurate. And so you had this, combat developed along the lines of basically forming a massive human shotgun and hoping to hit as many people as possible. Um, but as the Age of Discovery came into being and Europeans began to move into the Americas and the New World, you started to see the needs of combat changing and the needs of what the theater of combat demanded from an army changing. Some people will point to the beginning of the American Rangers post Berkeley Plantation Massacre of 1622. Now, this was a massacre carried out by Chief Powhatan. And basically, Chief Powhatan felt that there had been an uneasy peace that had developed between the settlers and the Indians, but Chief Powhatan basically felt that the settlers were expanding at a too rapid rate, and at the end of the day, they didn't just want trade; they wanted land. And so his response to that was to, send dozens and dozens of Indians of his men into the villages and towns that existed at the time, and then engage in a massacre of women, children, whoever they could get their hands on. They killed anybody they could, and so they killed actually about a quarter to a third of the population of the colony at the time. And this was a turning point. A lot of historians feel this is a turning point in European American history, because this is where settlers begin to range out. This is where they begin to not just stay in their little villages and trade with the Indians, but they begin to go out into the wilderness to fight with the Indians and to push them back, and to gain control over this land and this wilderness. And the way they do this, actually, they're taught by other Indians. Generally speaking, I think an underknown fact about the the Age of Discovery and the colonization and whatnot, at least in the Americas, is that many of these Indian tribes, for example, the tribe of Chief Powhatan, subjugated other Indian tribes and basically exerted their authority and their control on them, and had a great many rivalries with these different tribes. And so oftentimes these lesser tribes would assist the Europeans. And so there was these kinds of, tribal dynamics that the Europeans really utilized and exploited to, learn how to use the land, learn how to move in the land, how to survive off the land, how to blend into the wilderness and the forest, and really meld European tactics with Indian tactics, which were more appropriate for this world that they were now in. Now, the first true Ranger company was formed for King Philip's War by the governor of the Plymouth colony, Josiah Winslow, and the command was given to Colonel Benjamin Church. Now, this was, these companies were really the first recorded, standard, like somewhat standardized, let's say official military units, and they, as I mentioned before, were taught by the Indians, who were allies of the British at the time. Please excuse me. And so they were really taught by the Indians, and it was the Indians who educated them. It was the Indians who, brought them up in what they were trying to do with learning how to fight and specializing their area of expertise, which was ranging, irregular operations, etc. Some other people, you also look at, the basis of the story, the movie The Patriot, was Francis Marion. And he was, known as the Swamp Fox, and some people consider him, to have an influence on the Rangers. Colonel John Mosby of the Confederacy was a big character who really mastered hit and run cavalry tactics, this irregular kind of combat that, it really is important in the Americas. And he was so successful, actually, the area of the Confederacy, the area of the country in which he operated, was known as Mosby's Confederacy because of the effectiveness and the control he had over the area, because of how good he was at what he did. And so you have this history from 1622, arguably, through the King Philip's War, Queen Anne's War, 7 Years' War, American Revolution, various Indian conflicts, and the Civil War, of somewhat irregular type units being formed in the American military. However, it's there's no continuity. There was no continuous, standing Rangers regiment. There was, it's unclear as to how much the previous incarnation of the American Ranger influenced the next incarnation. That's something that's kind of, I had a difficulty finding clarity on. But it seems to me that it was more to be something where, you know, there was a certain theater that the Americas presented, and this theater was reacted to, and through Ranger units, through irregular Ranger units. But you know, upon such time as the close of the Civil War, American society and American politics was very much into isolationism. The thinking was that we have a large ocean on both sides, and we have two nations to the north and to the south of us, which we don't fear invasion from. So why do we need a large standing army? And so we really didn't. We really didn't maintain and continually, utilize and equip and train any kind of special operations unit. When World War I came along, we rapidly expanded the military, but World War I, and in the way in which war was waged during that conflict, specifically on the Western Front, there wasn't really a place for a Ranger type unit. The trees and the forests didn't exist on the Western Front. They had been destroyed by artillery. There was no, real sneaking around. That's not to say that, there wasn't any, type of special units in the war. One particular example, the Ardati for the Italian, the Kingdom of Italy, they were a very famous unit. Having said that, the Ardati were fighting in the Alps. They were mountain soldiers, which is a much different theater of combat than the Western Front, in which the Americans generally fought in. And so there wasn't any real effort to form a special unit. Now, fast forward to World War II. World War II is a much different animal, and technologies change. Technologies continue to change. And now we have a situation where the field of battle has changed, and people are trying to adjust to that. Countries are trying to adjust to that. So when you talk about the Rangers Regiment, the 75th Rangers Regiment, as we know it today, this is where it gets its start in World War II. Now, there's a lot of evidence that it wasn't even the American units, the previous American units, that inspired the American command to form this battalion, but it was in fact the British SAS. And the reason I say this is because Major General Lucian Truscott of the United States Army was a liaison officer for the British General Staff, basically for educational purposes. And in 1942, he submitted a proposal to General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff, that an American unit be set up along the lines of the British commandos. This was not a unique thought. This was not a thought held exclusively by Lucian Truscott. This was something that a lot of people felt that the American military could use. And so on General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff, he began to come to envision a unit, an elite unit of 50 volunteers. He selected Major William Darby for the position of battalion commander, and on June 8th, 1942, he commissioned the battalion, and he placed William Darby in charge. For the remainder of that time, actually Darby and the Rangers trained with the British and Canadian commandos. So which is why I go back to saying that I think the inspiration for the Rangers Regiment was not so much previous incarnations of American Rangers as it was the example that the British commandos were setting and the use that they had. And I think that was what the Americans looked to more so. Um, but this battalion began training, and at the time it wasn't the 75th Rangers Regiment. It's important to point that out. It was only the 1st Rangers Battalion. Their first engagement was August 19th, 1942, in the ill-fated Dieppe raid, which the 50 Rangers participated in, along with Canadian and British commandos. This was the first American action in Europe. So the first American action was first American boots on the ground, Ranger boots. And the first American to die was also a Ranger. His name was Lieutenant E.V. Loustalot. May he rest in peace, along with 2 other Rangers who were killed alongside of him. And those are the first American casualties in Europe. Now, the Dieppe raid was ill-fated, but the entire regiment first saw combat and first was deployed, entire battalion first was deployed in Arzew, Algeria. In February of 1943, February 11th, the Rangers had a successful raid on an Italian encampment at Sened Station. It was a nighttime raid, which was executed very successfully, and they managed to secure the encampment. They secured a lot of prisoners. They took a lot of its casualties, and earned the nickname from the Italians, the Black Death. And this was because of the nature of the raid. So later on, there was a big success for them, and it also really fit with what was envisioned of the Rangers. It really fit the bill when people envisioned, we want the Rangers, when the High Command envisioned the Rangers doing, X kind of missions. This is exactly what they were talking about. This is what they were looking for. A nighttime raid on an encampment, which is highly successful and basically eliminates the entire encampment. They had another very big successful operation in capturing the pass at Jebel El Ankh. They flanked the Italians there and managed to capture the pass, which was a massive success and a huge boon for the American forces at the time. And these early successes led Major William Darby to request a full regiment of Rangers, and this request was granted. And from that point on, the 75th Rangers Regiment, as we know it today, has existed in continuity from 1942, 1943, I suppose, is when the full regiment was formed, moved from the 1st Rangers Battalion to the 75th Rangers Regiment, made up of multiple battalions. And from that point on, this existed as a regiment. And that is the history of the foundation of the 75th Rangers Regiment as we know it today. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day.